T. It's in the name.
Welcome into the Helping Healing Humor with Ben and Travis podcast. Today, we're talking a little bit about technology in our faith. And we'll be having that conversation with Jason Helton, the media outreach minister at Madison Church of Christ. And we'll have that conversation right after these important messages. This episode of the Helping Healing Humor with Ben and Travis podcast is presented by Faulkner University. Faulkner University is a private Christian liberal arts university based in Montgomery, Alabama, with a mission to provide an education anchored by not only intellect, but also character and service. The Faulkner experience aims to educate the whole person. Every individual matters every day. We all want to become better versions of ourselves. No one wants to remain trapped where they are because of missed opportunities and unrealized dreams. At Faulkner University, we believe your dreams don't have an expiration date. We understand that you're looking for more than a degree. You want to find your niche and thrive in your career. Whether you're a high school senior just beginning your trek or an adult student looking for a better path, Faulkner is here to help guide your journey. Go to faulkner.edu to apply or get more info. That's faulkner.edu. I'm Travis Creasy. That's All-Pro Counselor with Three Chord Counseling in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Ben Hayes, how are you, man?
I am doing good. Just living the dream, getting to hang out with you guys and enjoying another podcast. And we've got with us also Mr. Will Myhan. So, Will, how you doing today?
Man, I'm doing good. It was fun. We're recording on a Saturday night. Watching some of our deacons blow torch our parking lot today. So
that was interesting.
That was kind of fun, getting ready for worship tomorrow. One of those things you never thought you'd see, but here we are in the snowpocalypse of North
Digging
Alabama.
up some snow, some ice, and maybe a little bit of pavement along the way, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it all worked out. So just excited that we have Jason. If you missed the intro, that's Jason Helton. He's the media outreach minister, or as we like to call him, the mom minister over in Madison. Just a wonderful guy. Have gotten to know him pretty well over the past couple of years and just does some dynamite stuff in the church. And so we're looking forward to his thoughts today. So Jason, how are you, man?
Hey, I'm doing great. Appreciate you guys having me. We have deacons with blowtorches as well, but we use those in the auditorium for an object lesson. So a little different than I think what your guys are doing, but that's good too. So.
Well, we might have to work it now that we know that's a possibility. Now that that's on the agenda.
Yeah, if you already got it in the budget, man, might as well stretch it.
We are excited to have you, especially the stuff that you're doing in the church now. I know that you've got some seminars that you are putting out and doing across the brotherhood, and so we want to talk a little bit about that. And maybe even you can kind of introduce your seminar here just at the beginning to maybe see if some people are interested in some more info on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super grateful for the invitation to join you guys. Appreciate so much what you do, what you guys do specifically with counseling and different ways to bring humor into ministry. It's filling a void that's been out there for a while. I was doing some grad school research a couple of months back, and I realized there are other gaps that we have in the church too. And one of those is there's just not a lot of conversations that I could find going on about faith and technology and how they interact, specifically how technology informs and shapes us spiritually. And so started doing a little bit more digging on that in some research, and then realized that there's a lot actually to that conversation. To put together a 12-week class for Madison that talked specifically about those topics, and from there realized that this is something that other churches could possibly benefit from as well. And so I've taken those 12 lessons and created anywhere from a 3 to 5 session workshop for churches called the Analog Faith and Digital Babylon Workshop. A little bit of a mouthful, but the key here is to realize that we live analog lives still, and that in the midst of this digital age, there's a lot to navigate, there's a lot to understand and think about. And oftentimes it becomes in the mentality of people when it comes to technology, well, that's just a young person thing, just a teenager thing, or teenage families kind of thing. But it impacts all of us. And technology, from the light bulb to cars to computers to the internet, has been forming and shaping us spiritually for a long time. It's really important that we develop discernment and wisdom to be able to navigate that. And the adults in the room need to do that, especially so that we can teach emerging generations how to think about technology. The technology will continue to evolve and change, but we need to develop skill sets so they know how to navigate those changes and those new developments. If we really believe that there's nothing new under the sun, like Solomon said, then the Bible applies to the digital age as much as it does to any other age. So the workshop is designed specifically for church leaders, for adults, for Christians, for all ages, really. And we talk about how analog consequences, there are some analog consequences to the digital sins that we have out there, how social media is forming and shaping us, especially when it comes to our habits, and it comes to sleep patterns, it comes to anxiety, depression, things like that. We talk about the age gap and how technology is actually something that Satan leverages to divide us more based off of our ages. And some of that age gap is just perceived, it's not real. And we have to be wise and discerning about that. Talk about faith and sexuality and technology, as well as some ways that the church can actually positively use new technologies to leverage in a big way, kind of like we're doing here. Podcast, 10, 15 years ago in the church were not really a thing, but you guys have found a way to leverage a great technology and to use that for good. So it's not all gloom and doom by any means. We need to learn how to steward the technologies we've been given to leverage for the gospel. So talk about all those types of things in the workshop, as well as some others. If a church has specific things they want to go over, then we can certainly do that as well.
Has that been something that's been pretty well received, as you've gone out and gone? I know you said you presented it first at Madison, and then you've kind of gone beyond with it. Seems like something that's been well received in the churches.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a big part of that is because people don't know where to start to some degree. And there's just not a lot of literature in the church specifically. And so I think that's a big part of it, is that folks, we know that social media is kind of an issue, but we don't necessarily know how to frame it spiritually. We know that there's always sexual temptations out there, and technology has enabled those, but we haven't really consistently framed sexuality in a spiritual context so that it actually, the terminology is calibrated. That's kind of the word I use, is a lot of times technology emerges and we don't put modern vernacular in the context of scripture actively or accurately or effectively. And so emerging generations kind of have these dual vocabularies that don't really overlap, when in reality they have to. Our faith is how we see the world, right? So I think a lot of congregations struggle to provide help to their families and even to their leadership to see the relevance of some of these things. Older folks kind of are dismissive of, well, that's a young man's game. Well, you need to be a part of that as well, because it impacts us. And we're all prone to patterns in our livelihood, and automation and technology really feeds in that mentality. So when we think that we should have access to something, but now we have limited access because of internet or the weather, like we're doing, these last few days, there's been ice storms and stuff. Our best doesn't come forward sometimes because we're inconvenienced or we're frustrated, but we're not actually persecuted. And we kind of get those mixed up, because in this digital age, everything is instant and everything is, when I want it, I should have it. So my desires should be fulfilled in every context. And that's just not the way that Jesus has taught us to live by any means. And so I think it's really important for folks to think in those terms. And the workshop helps kind of bring up conversations. We won't necessarily solve all the world's problems, but it does bring out new conversations and gives everybody some resources and some tools to then go and dig a little deeper and to develop discernment. That's really the aim, is for us to think more deeply about our technology. So yeah, it's definitely been well received, I would say.
Just trying to get people talking about it.
Discernment is a big word for me. The last few years, I've been trying to cut back on my social media posting, other than podcasts. Like this podcast has really helped me, if nobody else, because it keeps me posting stuff about it rather than my sports opinion or political opinion, even though it is election year. But I think all of us fall in that age where we are trying to bring our parents along, whether it's setting up their cell phone. And I know Ben and I fall in the category of needing Will to kind of keep us updated. And then Will's probably like, man, I don't even know the new stuff, but that's the thing, is it's constantly moving. And so, what are some ways, talking about social media, how does that shape our faith? What's the data? What have you found in your research?
Yeah, so social media is a big one. So much so that this past May, the U.S. Surgeon General came out with his report, and he said that he recommended 16 being the age where people begin having access to social media, and he cited a bunch of really good research. This research has been around for a while, but if the Surgeon General is the one saying, "Hey, we've got a problem," then it's probably a much bigger spiritual problem than we can imagine. I kind of describe where we are today as kind of where we were in the late 80s and 90s with big tobacco. You remember the commercials where it was I wake up in the morning, they had the little voice modulator deal, and there were all of these really heartfelt. Some of them were funny. Most of them were really heartfelt and serious in tone, saying, "Hey, smoking and nicotine products are really, really bad for us. So stop, or prevent your friends from doing it." Secondhand smoke was a big thing. I remember growing up during that time. Well, we had research for decades that says this stuff is killing us. In fact, the first U.S. Surgeon General report about nicotine and tobacco products, I think, came out in like 1964, somewhere in the 60s.
Wow.
So you fast forward, it took 30 years just for us to start having a public opinion shift and realize the danger. Because otherwise, it was always in movies, it was always a part of pop culture, and it was accepted and embraced and encouraged and cultivated, really. Remember Joe Cool, the camel, was really marketed towards young people, and they had to change that because legislation eventually caught up to it. But if we're waiting on legislation to put in the guardrails of what's healthy for us, especially when it comes to things spiritually, we're always going to be a generation behind. Big tobacco spent decades and billions of dollars to control popular opinion. And if they could do that, then they can continue to make money. And social media has kind of been the same, in my opinion. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of money spent and a lot of perception being built. Guys like Zuckerberg have cast this vision for a global network, everyone on the planet being connected and networked. I don't want the rest of the world being connected to my children. And so I don't share his vision for the future, right? That's kind of what he's tried to sell everybody on and create the metaverse as a part of that. I think what we're seeing now with the data that we've had collected over the last 10 or 15 years, we're just now really kind of getting good, consistent data that says what technology has been selling for the last 20, 30 years is not actually what it's been producing. From about 2012 on, you see a really big spike in the dark triad, right? The anxiety, depression, and suicide ideation reports. And it does this number specifically for younger millennials and especially Gen Z. Gen X, it impacts a little bit. And it's interesting when you look back at kind of the way technology and the digital age developed. Gen X were the first ones to be online. We think of the creators of YouTube, Google folks, Facebook. Most of those cats are going to be Gen Xers because the internet came out and they were the first ones to be there. But then millennials took it to a whole nother level, and we lived online. But for me, Facebook came out. It was the Facebook.com when I was a sophomore in college. So we're talking 2004, 2005-ish, somewhere in there. So early 2000s, that's when we see a big pivot on the social side of things. Well, 2012, what's significant about that year, it is the very first year that more than half, the majority of teenagers in the United States had access to a cell phone and therefore access to social media. So that first probably 7-year period, we were in the midst of this social online social community that was being built and expectation. But we didn't know what the impact was going to be. We were just on the front of the wave. But eventually, what does a wave do when it gets to the beach? It comes crashing down. And that's when we start really seeing in 2012. What we have in emerging generations is they're maturing much later. So there's actually, I forget the guy's name, but there's a sociologist out there that's trying to create a new life stage, the stages of life. His is not delayed adulthood. I forget his exact terminology, but it's adulthood that's not really adulthood. It's like a pre-adulthood, but it's not adolescence either. It's somewhere in between, and it's not quite young adulthood. It's a delayed adulthood. So children are moving back in with their parents in their 20s, and they're not setting out on their own like they used to. Kids are maturing later. They're waiting to get cars. I don't know about you guys, but when I turned 16, that was an age of freedom, and I lived about 485 steps away from the grocery store. The day I turned 16, I drove my car to the grocery store because I could. because driving there was like driving to the Mexico border. You know, it was just a sign of freedom. And I didn't paint my face quite like William Wallace, but I had this freedom, you know, it was all around. Well, today kids are waiting till they're 17, 18 years old to drive, to get their license to be able to drive. They are, the stats are saying that they're sexually active later in life, which seems like a good thing. They're drinking alcohol later in life, seems like a good thing. They're not more noble. They're not a more chivalrous age. Just things are very different for them. All of their freedoms they have been experiencing from a very, very young age through their devices. And so freedom itself is different in their minds. And that's a really, really big difference that especially 60, 70, 80-year-olds, they can't fathom. They don't understand it at all. And I really don't understand some of that to some degree as well, and not being that far removed from it. But that's one of the big ways from a data and science standpoint. These are all secular facts and figures, right? These are not slanted towards church or anything like that. These are broad sweeping generalities. There's a book called Generations by Jean Twenge that I would highly recommend. She goes through and examines a bunch of different trends and data. She's got one of the largest data sets among generation studies that we've seen, and she published it in her book. It's really eye-opening to see the differences, but also the similarities. Sexual revolution that started in the 60s really hasn't ended. And we're in the midst of that today. And yet, in the midst of all of that, you add in the digital age, it just kind of wreaks havoc there.
I'm going to speak of my hypocrisy really quickly. You know, I'm on my phone way too much, especially since we've been in snowpocalypse, as we mentioned. But when I got home from school, if I had a bully at school, I just had to make it till 3:00, right? And it was over, at least till I went to school the next day. And now the bully follows me everywhere, right? An Auburn fan can reach me at any point if they want to on my social media. I can't get away from it. I can, right? But when I talk to my students, and I go, hey, just turn your phone off, right? Like if it's getting to you, I mean, that's just a no-go. Like that is not an option that they are willing to even fathom, or at least one they've not thought about.
That's interesting as well, especially from a parent standpoint. So as a punishment, parents oftentimes take away their phones. Well, what's happening is that kids are developing these synthetic relationships. That's a phrase that Tristan Harris coined. He was a former Google ethicist. He's one of the guys behind the Social Dilemma documentary. And he says they form these these synthetic relationships with their devices, with technology. And the analogy I use is, do you guys remember the little Tamagotchi, the little Digipets that were real popular back in the 90s? And they're like little keychain, little digital animal that you had to press certain buttons to feed it, to make sure that it got its sleep and all that. Well, after a couple of days, you sort of bonded with that little device, thinking that, you know, I got to keep it alive. And somebody at lunch one day would take it and press a bunch of buttons and kill it. You were devastated. Well, on a whole nother level, emerging generations today are forming these relationships with their devices. So as a parent, I'm taking your phone away from you. In your mind, you're taking away a device. In their mind, you're taking away a relationship. They relate to that the same way that they relate to if you just took their best friend out of their life. So that's a really important thing to understand, is how we relate to technology. We can't allow the emerging generations around us to see technology as a relationship worth investing in. It's a tool to steward. It's not the substance of the relationship, but they don't necessarily see that, especially with emerging technologies like ChatGPT, AI models that are out there. ChatGPT, the biggest danger I see is that it is conversational in how it interacts with you. And so for me, as an adult, I know it's a chatbot, and I know that it is really, really powerful at analyzing a bunch of data from the internet and then spewing it out to me in really helpful ways in a lot of instances. But if I'm an 11 or 12-year-old, 2 or 3 at night, and I'm asking it, why do people hate me? Is there a God? Like all these big questions. You know, the 3 questions of adolescence, right, are identity, who am I, community, where do I belong, and then what is my purpose? Like if you're asking those kinds of questions as an adolescent to technology that is basically just combing the internet, these massive data sets, and spewing out, that's not good. That's not a good thing at all. And so as our emerging generations, they're maturing later, but they're exposed to more adult content, and not just from a sexual standpoint, adult content in general. The world is more exposed to them than any other generation previous. It's a really terrible place. They're under equipped and overexposed essentially. They've never been more connected online, but offline they've never been more disconnected either. So that's a really, really big impact that we've seen on those stats in the last 10 years or so.
So what would you say are some things, like if you could just nail down a couple of things that maybe churches or leadership or people should do, knowing all of this that you've shared with us? What are a couple of things that maybe nuts and bolts that people can work on in helping their families, helping their churches, whatever it may be?
I think the number one thing is relationship. Sticky Faith was very revolutionary in their research a few years back, particularly in youth ministry, and their research cited multiple points of contact with mature Christians. I think it was like 6 or more relationships in the church would make a student exponentially more likely to be faithful in college and after college, rather than just having a contact with their parents or just their youth minister. I think that now more than ever, when we can be in a digital community easily with little to no effort, it takes a lot of effort to be in an analog community. And that means that if you're an adult and you're listening to this and you don't have kids, you're vital. You need to be cultivating relationship, be an active member of your youth ministry, teaching children's classes, being a part of these kids' lives, going to ball games, connecting with them, with parents and grandparents, making sure that we have really strong relationships in the church. That's gonna strengthen everything. And I think one thing that we saw over the last 150 plus years, probably longer than that, but as our society has shifted from an agricultural society to an industrial, and we've also gone very, very individualistic. And that's also happened in the church in a lot of ways as well. The fact that we can now stream worship and stay in our own homes can make us incredibly isolated and individualistic in our thinking. And the gospel is very counter to that. It's very, just the mere essence of God, 3 in 1. There's a community element there. And so I think that's really, really important, that relationship is at the core of who God is and who God's people are as well. So the first one is relationship, and analog relationship specifically. And by that, I mean using platforms to communicate. But this technology we're using it's the tool for communication. Our relationship is the substance of what's really going on here. And so we got to keep that as the main focus. Jesus talked a lot about, the way Jesus talked about ease in life in the Sermon on the Mount. He said that wide is the gate and easy is the way, the path that leads to destruction. There are many who will find it because it takes little to no effort. If we're Christians and we're trying to live faithfully in this digital age, and we put forth zero effort to think critically about technology, then it's going to be very easy. But Satan will take us down the road that he wants us to go. The very difficult, narrow way is the way that Jesus said leads to eternal life. And so to me, that means we need to stop and think very, very deeply. Paul talks about discerning what the will of God is, developing this idea of discernment. And it's new for me too, Travis. It's not something that I necessarily have always been good at, but discernment essentially is thinking a little deeper, taking some time to examine your options and to think critically, learn to think like Jesus. Those bracelets back in the day of what would Jesus do were actually kind of helpful. What would Jesus think about this? What kind of guidance would Jesus give me today? And the more we read the Bible, I think of it less of a textbook and a history book and more as God's journal. It's insight into who our Creator is and how he relates to us and his people and his will for our lives. So the more we have time with Scripture, the more we have time with spiritually minded people that are wise. Surround yourself with older people that can discern, that can teach you how to think spiritually. Then I think we're going to find ourselves in some better places. But it takes time. We didn't get here quickly, and we won't move forward quickly either. Even though technology seems to move at an exponential rate, the fact that gossip has always been around. It's online as well. The fact that all these sins have been around forever. That's why the scriptures are just so relevant today. Psalm 119:37 says, "Turn my eyes, keep my eyes from looking at worthless things." Like if there's ever a passage that is written for the digital age and specifically social media, nailed it. There it is. So I think just teaching the next generation, first examining ourselves as adults, but then trying to find ways to teach emerging generations how to think about technology. They're going to teach us how to operate it, but just because they can operate technology doesn't mean that they know how to navigate technology. And that's our role as parents, as fathers, as ministers, and just as we kind of stand in the gap of these oldest and youngest generations. We've had a unique experience with technology, so we got to put that to use to leverage for the gospel.
So we got to talking, and Ben has the Friday refresh, and kind of the goal of doing the short clips is because attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. And so I would never, and people would say, "Oh, you guys got a TikTok?" I said, "Yeah," and I would never tell you to download or have an account if you don't have one already, right? And so I always preface it with that. But we also want to put stuff out that's good on those platforms, and of course, being members of the Church of Christ, we got a lot of people who have some great free content that they put out there. But what is the balance there as a church? What are 2 to 3 things that we should be doing right now?
I think COVID forced everybody to move our floor higher, right? So now the minimum that most churches have is a live stream and a website that works, and likely online giving of some sort. I think it's very appropriate for churches to be on places like YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Those are the 3 that we're on at Madison. And my rationale for that is Instagram gets a lot of younger folks as well as older folks. If you see the migration, Facebook, there are very few of the emerging generations that are still on Facebook or that are on Facebook at all. But millennials will always be there because it came out at a very nostalgic time of our life, very formative years in college in the early 2000s. And so I think Facebook will always have us. Facebook is a fantastic conduit to your community as well. There are multiple times a week on what's happening in Madison or what's happening in Huntsville, community groups. People ask about new churches to visit and things like that. So that's a great place for a church to have a presence and to communicate. Like Sunday, whether you're going to have services or not because of weather, you can do really, really good things with Facebook and Google ads to advertise to your community about events and ministries that you offer. Those seem like really healthy places to be. There's also an unhealthy element to that. So I think the people that are in charge of your accounts need to be people that are very wise, people that are very spiritually mature and can leverage some comedy, but know where that line is and stay away from it. You don't want to be in the news for the wrong reasons. You can go viral for multiple reasons, and we want to make sure those are positive. Instagram, as you mentioned, their algorithm, like everybody else, has changed over the last couple of years. Vertical video that is 60 seconds or less is super popular. And part of the reason for that is because all of these companies have hired brain people. They have hired PhDs in psychology to help create and hone their platforms, which is also why 41 or 42 states now, I think, are in the midst of a lawsuit with big tech companies like Facebook, Meta, because they've known all this research and they've really done a dishonest job of marketing to young people in particular and cultivating addictive behaviors and addictive models and how they go about developing their technologies. So that's the negative for sure. But churches being on YouTube, that is the number 2, biggest wise, it's the number 2 search engine on the planet behind Google. So it's a great place for people to go to ask any questions. How can I change the oil in my car? Also, what does the Bible say about God? Who is Jesus? So if churches will put content on YouTube, they can find all kinds of an audience out there that normally would not walk into your building, folks that are all across the world. So you can create, very few organizations put out as much content as most churches. I'll say that. Every week we do worship, Bible studies. So if you're already capturing that and you're streaming it for your people, think one level out from that. Well, how can this be used evangelistically? Our worship has never been more evangelistic than it has over the last 3 years, as most churches now have migrated to live streaming. The next step of that would be to take your live stream and have somebody chop it up into some sound bites to utilize the way some of these platforms are using short form, just like you guys do. Take it and put it in bite-sized pieces. Pizza's always good. If you had some good quotes or some good one-liners, posting those and posting the video side of that, and making sure you putting the words on there on the screen now. You notice everybody does that because a lot of times if you're holding a crying baby or sleeping, baby. You're going to be scrolling through and you're not going to listen. You're going to read it. So it's interesting, some of those trends that churches could really easily adapt what they're already doing and just create it for that platform. So Instagram, you can do images, but video is really becoming more popular with Reels, and that's because Snapchat got really popular, and then TikTok took over. And so the Snapchat and TikTok, I think you really have to kind of create a brand to be successful on those, and that's where I stop our line, because I don't necessarily want to be a brand for the church as a person, but you really need a personality. It works really well, I think, for you guys because y'all are the personality of the show. That's a little bit different than a whole congregation and Jesus, right? So there's a lot of discernment that goes into, is this right for us? Is it not? And some churches do it, and some of them do it really well. But it's not necessarily a place that I felt like I had the skill set to take us and to do it responsibly. So that's one reason why we don't. But in the same ways you mentioned, it can certainly be leveraged. And I think the mentality that people are there, that's why we go there, is a good rationale. But I think it also has its limits sometimes. To some degree, you cross into a line of danger where the danger outweighs the benefits.
Being in youth ministry for the past 12, 14 years, I've seen a lot of parents go, hey, I know these things are dangerous, but I really don't know how to have any conversations about it. It's almost like every one of our parents know the dangers of social media, but I would say 85% of our parents don't do anything about it. And so I know you're a parent, we're all parents. Maybe even just as we get to the end of this episode, how do you even start to have that conversation? Or how do you take the importance of a topic and take it from a thought and put it into action? Definitely
now being a parent, and my oldest is 9 and my youngest is 1.5. So I'm sure it's going to change as they continue to get older. When it comes to talking to a kid about social media, I really like the idea of using the way we do driver's license. At 16, you can drive if you have shown aptitude, right? If you've read the manual and had to show the competency that you understand the rules, and you take a test. So you have to do research. You have to show that you understand the research. You have to have chaperone time behind the wheel. There's incremental liberty given to you. And as you show the ability to make good decisions and you show knowledge of how to discern and to utilize this tool of transportation, then you get more freedom. I think using that same approach with social media is really good as well. I can't go to my parents and say, okay, mom and dad, how did you approach social media with me and screen time with me? It wasn't a thing. I think as a parent, I need to learn more about anatomy. I need to learn more about how our brains work. The prefrontal cortex of our brain, the one that's responsible for all the big stuff, decision making, trying to recognize regret before you have it, those kinds of things. It doesn't fully develop till your mid-20s. And so we're basically dropping. How old would your kid need to be before you're comfortable dropping them in downtown Beijing or New York City and say, get home for dinner? Because that's what we do when we just give them access to the world and the world access to them. So all along the way as they're growing up, this is specifically for parents of young children, what do they need to understand before they get on social media? They need to understand what truth is and what it looks like and what it sounds like. They need to understand what gossip is, what it looks like, what it sounds like. They need to understand authenticity. They need to, all of these traits that we want them to exhibit online, we have to point them out before they get online. And we have to show them what that looks like. We've told our kids multiple times, you're likely not going to get a tablet or a phone before any of your friends, and probably be one of the last, if not the last one. Well, why is that? Well, because right now we need to see a pattern of behavior that you make good decisions when you're entrusted with freedom. And you have that conversation in a multitude of ways. I think one mistake that was made in my lifetime growing up, and it's not a critique of my parents, it was just as a whole in the church, was we talked about having the talk with our kids. It was one talk about the birds and the bees. Well, that is grossly inadequate. It would also be grossly inadequate to have one conversation about social media and think that's going to cover all the scenarios. It's just not. It's unrealistic and immature thinking to feel that way. we can no longer be okay with allowing uncomfortable situations to keep us from having important conversations. It's just, there's no excuse. It's never really been an excuse, but the stakes are way too high right now because the access is just exponential when it comes to social media. So for parents, one, become learned. You're less intimidated by things that you know a lot about oftentimes. And I think this is one of those things. commonsensemedia.org is a great resource. They're actually they're cited in a lot of research of other secular institutions. They'll bring up Common Sense quite a bit. Common Sense is not a church affiliated website by any means, but it is pro-family in a pretty traditional sense, and they do a lot of reviews on music, on TV shows and movies, but they've got a lot of social media information as well. Bark Technologies is another great resource, especially if your child is getting into having a device and having social media. I would highly recommend you look into Bark. They have a lot of paid services that are very effective. They also have their own research that's available. They're a good follow on Instagram as well. There's a lot of good information there. Start really, really small with a flip phone. If kids want to be connected, then give them a telephone. People say that we have to have life a certain way and our teenagers have to have these things. And yeah, there is fear of missing out. All of those things are real, but you can drive up the road from here just about an hour and a half and you can find a community of Amish people that have deliberately chosen to live distinctly different. So I don't buy that it has to be a certain way. And that's one of the biggest lies I think the digital age has sold parents, is that I have to have these things for my kids because I didn't like to feel left out. I don't want them to feel left out. Well, we gotta teach resilience as much as anything these days. And now it's actually taken more effort to teach resilience because our life is so automated due to technology that resilience isn't really built in anymore. There's not physically working with your hands anymore. The generation that was taught to work smarter, not harder, has done so. And technology has then allowed us to no longer know how to work hard. So there's some consequences in the lifestyle that we choose to live. But we have to understand that we are choosing that lifestyle. Parents in particular have to check their own habits. And that's the struggle I see in my generation, is that I am addicted to my phone in many ways. And I'm connected to social media in ways that are not healthy. And I have to take breaks. I have to be very deliberate and delete apps off my phone. I have to leave my phone in places physically. Otherwise, I will naturally gravitate towards them in unhealthy ways. My kids have never known their father without him being on Facebook. My parents got Facebook like a few years ago. So I can't parent my kids based off of my experience with social media, because the social media has changed quite a bit. There are some different challenges here. So I've got to be willing to research. I've got to be willing to have sometimes awkward and uncomfortable conversations. Most importantly, I got to be consistent. And I would encourage parents to start young. If you got teenagers and you feel like you've already, that ship has sailed, that boat has gone off, it's not too late. It's not too late at all. Have them research some things. Pink, the entertainer, the singer, her child asked her for social media. I thought she had such a great response. She said, you can have social media when you show me research that says it's good for you. Because I got a pile of papers here that say it's not. But when you find academic, peer-reviewed research and bring it to me, then we'll talk. I think that's very fair as spiritually minded people, that there are other layers to that. So we have to get really, really skilled at calibrating the language and making sure that they see the relevance of Scripture, that it speaks to today. Identity, community, purpose, those three things that adolescents are seeking, a lot of adults are seeking too. Social media doesn't necessarily provide the answers for those. Jesus is the answer for all of those things. The church, his people, and we have to show them in very tangible ways. We got to make sure that the church experience that they have growing up is the true church, that we're honest, that we confess sin, that that we pray with each other, and those kinds of things. So I think it's a big conversation, more than one podcast can answer, of course, but hopefully that gives at least a couple of places to start.
The mission of Heritage Christian University is simple. They aim to advance the churches of Christ by equipping servants through undergraduate and graduate programs. HCU produces effective communicators of the gospel, focusing on evangelism and a commitment to Scripture. Heritage Christian University offers 5 degrees: Associate of Arts in Biblical Studies, Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Studies, Master of Arts, Master of Ministry, and Master of Divinity. HCU is accredited by the Association for Biblical Higher Education and is an associate member of the Association of Theological Schools. Since 1968, Heritage Christian University has offered affordable degrees in biblical studies, allowing graduates to thrive in their ministries without the burden of loan debt. In fact, most graduates finish at HCU without owing anything for their education. For the spring 2024 semester, HCU is offering full tuition scholarships for the graduate level students. For more information about the scholarships they offer, visit www.hcu.edu. HCU invites you to the 2024 Heritage event at the Marriott Shoals Conference Center. Join them on Saturday, August 24th for an incredible night of music from the legendary Ricky Skaggs and Kentucky Thunder. General admission tickets and table sponsorships are available for purchase. Visit hcu.edu to purchase your tickets today. If you think HCU is the perfect university for you, visit hcu.edu to schedule a tour or apply today. Heritage Christian University helps you thrive in your ministry. I mean, we can go with the old standbys. What's your jam? Comes on the radio. It doesn't matter. Somebody's getting a show.
Music-wise, I'm kind of all over the map, but
Sweet.
It's most likely some form of 90s alternative, 90s hip-hop, which always gets a lot of interesting responses when people hop in my car and it's Biggie Smalls or something. But and then also like Avett Brothers, they just always kind of come back. John Mayer, like early John Mayer, not the sob rock weird stuff, but early stuff. Dave Matthews. It's kind of random. Lately, I have to confess this. I guess this is the answer to the question. I've really developed a liking for contemporary Western country, like Pearl Shirt Western, like really Western, like Charlie Crockett, and several. Yeah, it's a weird. I don't know how my algorithm got there, but that just goes to show you that kids, it's a dangerous thing to play with. Even Spotify can manipulate you and bring you to weird places you never thought you'd be, but I really kind of like it. They're really good storytellers.
Well, you need to say what you need to say, right? And
exactly.
We certainly appreciate you jumping on and sharing
my friends
with us. And I hope you gave us a lot to work with, and so I appreciate it. And we're going to have a second episode with Jason, and when we get him on, that episode may be for certain ages. Of course, we always give our warning out for those sort of things. But Jason, thank you for sharing that with us, especially kind of late on a Saturday night when you probably have some media obligations tomorrow, right?
Hey, absolutely, guys. I'm super grateful again to join you, and just specifically from all of us that benefit from you guys. Thank you for what each of you do, not just in your specific congregations, but what you do for the church and for God's kingdom as a whole.
Thanks for being with us for this episode of the Helping Healing Humor podcast. Be sure to download our free ebook, 28 Days of Focused Living, at benandtravis.com and receive all of our Helping Healing and Humor extra content directly in your inbox. We look forward to having you join us at the same Ben and Travis time, same Ben and Travis channel.